thanks to all of you. As I said yesterday, this is a very memorable and meaningful occasion for me. It was probably 87, right, Rick? Yes. So so that's almost 30 years since I've met Father Bruno, and our conversations were not all that frequent because I've been based both in Los Angeles and Chicago and elsewhere, but certainly very rich. And as I was saying yesterday, I am extremely grateful, having read some of his work, that I knew him, because for me, the person really brought the thought alive. And whenever I read him, I always had his voice and his presence and his wit illuminating the text, which helped enormously. And so I'm glad for those of you who didn't get a chance to meet him, that at least you were able to sort of see him on videotape. It's not quite the same thing, because as those of you know who actually met him, he was a force of nature. I mean, in his quiet way, there was just this torrent of words and ideas that one would sort of vainly try to keep up with. and certainly, I mean, in my own presentation this morning, it is going to be a rather modest attempt on my part. And I'm very glad also, I should say, that looking at the program, there are many different aspects of Bruno's work, because not only was his range of interests so enormous, from philosophy to poetry to theology to his training in the natural sciences, but he also spoke in different voices. We spoke this morning about language, and my own language, as you'll see in my presentation, is going to be largely analytic. And so in terms of the kind of musical analogy that Chris Pramuk sort of brought up, I am going to give the prosaic reflections of a member of the audience. And the music was played in Chris's talk, and certainly in Father Bruno's ideas. And so what I'd like to do is come up with a few reflections, and I'm taking the conversational part of it seriously, and I'm glad there is a timekeeper, so that even though I, in other contexts, am very much against the tyranny of linear time, still with Cyprian's sage warning that lunch is, thanks to monastic discipline, fixed at 12:30, and I certainly don't want to be the person who keeps you from lunch and conversation. So that would be most unmonastic. So what I'm going to do is to present a few parameters of reflection, starting with the title of Bruno's book, The Future of Wisdom, which again delights my heart that he didn't confine it, at least in the main title, to Christian wisdom, though I am going to be focusing my remarks largely on Christian wisdom. But I'm glad that Bruno's own title was far more expansive, because this, as we all know, and it doesn't need belaboring in this audience, is a time of global conversation. I say this because, as a professional philosopher, there are something like 900 departments of philosophy in various colleges and universities. And I'd like you to guess in how many of them Indian philosophy, which is a 4,000-year tradition, how many of them have courses. Leave aside, there are no, I can give you one answer. There's no professor of Indian philosophy for just that subject in the entire United States. All right. But I'd like you to guess how many courses of Indian philosophy there are taught in philosophy departments on a regular basis at universities around the United States. Anyone care to guess? 5. CIS is one of the, so that eliminates one of the 5, all right? And then there's some at the University of Chicago. But this is an important point, and that's why I say the future of wisdom is, in its breadth, something that delights me. Because, and this came up recently for those of you who are reading the New York Times, it came up as an op-ed where 2 philosophers, one of whom teaches Chinese philosophy and the other of whom teaches Indian Buddhist philosophy, wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times saying, look, this struggle to get Indian philosophy taught in academic departments has been going on now for something like at least 50 to 60 years. And we who teach Indian philosophy are clearly losing the battle. So why don't our Western colleagues who insist that there's no reason to qualify the term philosophy with Western philosophy, but of course find the need to qualify Indian philosophy as India, all right? So it's synonymous that philosophy is Western in origin. Why don't our colleagues, after 60 years of this debate, just be honest and say, look, this is in fact a Western philosophy course. And there was a torrent of views, you can check it out yourself. So I think you get the point that, I mean, this is a welcome gathering for someone like myself where there's an openness to global wisdom. But I just want to register the fact, and it's also true in Australia, where in philosophy departments, and this is on methodological grounds, all right? So it's not as if Indian philosophy is not taught at all, but it's taught in anthropology and in history and in language departments, because the standard response of Western philosophers is that Indian philosophy contains wisdom, but wisdom looked at in the most derisive, non-philosophical way, right? I don't want this conversation to be a downer, but I just want us to reflect that, and to reflect also on the fact that what I think this audience takes for granted is by no means the case of what happens in academia. And again, there is a big fight that needs to be waged there. Now, whether in theology departments the situation is different because there is not, of course, a 4,000 year of Indian theology, but still there is a recognizable set of schools of Indian theology, and whether there's the same provincialism that prevails in theology departments, my colleagues would have to tell me. But that's enough said on that point. My title today is Sapiential Christianity in a Pluralistic World, and I noticed that Roger is already looking at his watch, so I'm going to come straight to the point. No more polemics, Roger. I know what the Jesuits are like. I mean, not half as kind as the Camaldoli. I mean, so I've had 12 years of Jesuit education, so I know what I'm in for. Okay, all right. So the first point that I want to make is that I'm not really going to define sapiential. Nanette did a wonderful job. We heard from both Merton and from Fr Bruno that I think we can work with the idea of wisdom as truth that vivifies, deepens, integrates our perspectives on life, and hence the term distilled wisdom, which I think conveys some of this power of wisdom to strike at the heart of the matter, to open up the imagination, to deepen the soul, and to illuminate our path through life. So, what I'm really going to focus on is the pluralistic age in my title. And I want to start first with a political point, which is that we are in what we might call a post-colonial era, right? And this, of course, has at least two dimensions. Please sort of, again, keep these points as notes, which we can come back to in our conversation, because I'm really going to make some telegraphic points, which we can then, depending on your inspiration, take in different directions as the Spirit moves us. But we are living in a post-colonial era where the Christianity, which was the religion of empires, all right, Spain, Portugal, and the European powers, all right, which then was taken to the sort of non-European world, all of them colonies, all right, gave a particular character to Christianity, all right, and also shaped the theology, because as we know, all thought occurs in certain political and historical and existential contexts, right? And clearly the idea of Western conquest and Western imperialism clearly used the theology as a tool. I mean, Desmond Tutu tells the joke about the Western missionaries going to Africa with their Bibles and meeting the native peoples and saying, let us all pray. And when we Africans, Desmond Tutu says, opened our eyes after the prayers, we had the Bibles and they had the land. So the idea of a triumphalistic Christianity is again something that I think we need to consider. But in this post-colonial period, wherever you want to date it, from the 50s onwards, when the countries of Africa and Asia and Latin America is still, of course, up in the air, but got their freedom, the Christianity also spread to these parts of the world in various forms. I'm really telescoping vast histories, but the important point that, again, for the future of Christianity, that I think is important to keep in mind, is that Christianity, looking at it now, not so much politically but demographically, is a post-European phenomenon. Again, this has been well documented. You go to the countries of Europe, churches have been converted into discos, to museums, and I think it's fair to say, in the interest of brevity, that Europe, the sort of breeding ground of much theology in the modern period, is now largely a post-Christian continent. And so and of course this has been demographically well established by the year, already now in 2016, something like 40 to 50% of the Christians in the world are in the countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the Pew Foundation projects that by the year 2050, some 34 years from now, that figure is going to go up to about 60 or 70%. Now, this is important, I think, for us to think when we think about the sort of future of Christianity, because of the point that I think concerns us, namely the relation of faith and culture. because if the Christianity of the modern period, the great theologians of the Ranas and the Mets and others whom we have heard, were European, it's clear that in the years to come, the theologians are going to be coming from Latin America, from Asia, and from Africa. And of course, the vital point will be to see how Jesus and theology are given local expressions. So, just to take a context that I'm familiar with, Jesus is presented, we were talking about a new language, and I notice people here who spent time in India, Jesus is presented as guru, as yogi, in images that of course are non-European, but of course open up the imagination. To what extent can this be a legitimate category, given what we know from scripture, given what we know from tradition, and of course given what we know from modern yogis? How legitimate is it to regard Jesus as yogi? What does that open up in terms of our language, in terms of our imagination? And likewise with other terms like Jesus as guru, and so on. So I think you get the idea, which I'll distill again, namely that increasingly in the third millennium of Christianity, in the 21st century onwards, we are going to get new non-European images of Jesus and the scriptures, and of course the reshaping of theology along non-European lines. Now, of course, this is hermeneutically not something that should altogether surprise Christians, because the very trajectory of Christianity has been an internally pluralistic one. When you consider that the communities that Jesus came from were largely, well, predominantly sort of Jewish communities, and then how with Paul Christianity moves to the Hellenic and Roman and then the European worlds. Christianity that began as a Jewish faith changes its character with Greek thought, Roman law, and with its cultural transformations. And so, of course, what this demographic figure that I put before us indicates is a question of saying that if the Jewish faith could really be accommodated in Greek categories, evoking the famous rhetorical question of Athanasius, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? A legitimate question when you consider how different the language of John's Gospel, for example, is from this storytelling and the parables of Jesus, all right? Bringing a huge linguistic and cultural shift, all right, already within the first 60 or 70 years of the evolution of Christianity. And of course, one of the things that has sadly not been told in histories of Christianity is the journey of Christianity to the churches of Ethiopia and Syria. And again, this is a tragedy as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I'm doing an encyclopedia of Indian Christianity at the moment, and the first couple of chapters, which I'm sort of trying to, just as a way of putting the project out there, is indicating the idea that in most of the prevalent global Christianity, histories of global Christianity, these Eastern churches merit something like, at most, a chapter or two. You can check it out for yourself. One of the most canonical works that has come out is that by McCulloch, Christianity of the First 3,000 Years, where again McCulloch spends to his credit, McCulloch is a first-rate historian, but again, he confesses that the sources, the histories of the non-European churches, the Syrian, the Eastern, and the Indian churches, is in fact extremely imbalanced in terms of the presentation. But again, that's something that I think we need to keep in mind in terms of this future projection, where the shape of Christianity will, as I say, be largely non-European, and again, I think some of these churches that in global Christianities have been somewhat quieter will be emerging, I think, with greater force, and certainly the new churches of Asia and Africa and of Latin America will be speaking, if you want, with the most prominent voices. So it's something that we need to, I think, be prepared for. So that is, if you want, the sort of cultural demographic challenge of the third millennium of Christianity. The third point that I want to make is, again, that not only are we going to get these new voices, but I think one of the features that we have already witnessed now in this post-colonial era is, in fact, the dialogue of religions. And again, this is a huge topic which could keep us occupied for a long time. I just want to take one sort of concrete example where, as you might be aware, it's been written up. The Benedictine monks, I think it was in England, I forget, and Cyprian, you might know, the experiment where the Dalai Lama's community was invited to, this was Lawrence Freeman, he was one of the sort of leading lights. Anyway, the point is this, that I'm going to give you a concrete example and then make a more general point. Some 12 or 14 monks from the Dalai Lama's community was invited into this Benedictine congregation and community and asked to give the homily. So the monks, the Buddhist monks, were given the scriptural texts and then given them well in advance, and then asked to give the homily. And that experiment of intermonastic living, because these people lived in the Benedictine community, and their reflections came out of that life together, and of course the shared liturgies, is, I think, one example among many where this dialogical spirit is clearly a new feature of our time. At a global level, I'll give another example, because I'm part of that, namely the dialogue between Christians and Buddhists predominantly in the United States and the West. But again, to telescope a very, very rich 50-year history, it has had a transformative effect on both faiths. This Christian-Buddhist dialogue has certainly given rise to one of the most prominent schools of contemporary Buddhism, called socially engaged Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh, Silak Shivaraksha, and others, where again, out of this dialogue, Buddhism sort of realized that while the Buddha's message had great power at the individual and perhaps family level, it had something to learn from Christianity, and this comes from Buddhists themselves, about the social ethic and the political ethic of Jesus. And hence, the development with Thich Nhat Hanh, Sulaksha Baraksha, Mahagoshananda and others of this relatively new school of socially engaged Buddhism, which came out of this dialogue. And likewise, I think on the Christian side, this dialogue brought people back to their contemplative traditions. Certainly Thomas Keating has recognized that centering prayer and the emphasis on centering prayer came out of this dialogue. So I bring that up as an example, one at the sort of concrete community level, the other, if you want, at a more global level, of transformations that we are going to be seeing as a result of this dialogue. Roger has just written an extraordinary book with Paul Nitter, who is Buddhist Christian or Christian Buddhist, depending on which day of the week it is. But of course, Roger here says he's kosher Christian. So the kosher Christian. So the point is that this has gotten the response it has because this dialogue is very much a part of our time. In the context of this discussion, because sort of non-duality has come up, and Bruno's intriguing comment that Christian non-duality, as he sees it, is not quite at home in Eastern versions of non-duality. I think, and of course, this very theme of non-duality is, whether in Merton or in Bruno, certainly a result of the dialogue with Eastern faiths, the rediscovery of non-dual thinkers like Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa and others within our Christian tradition, has certainly been one of the many, many fruits of interreligious dialogue. But I want to spend a little time on Bruno's comment and try to tease out some reflections on that. And these are not necessarily Bruno's, but mine, and I'd be very interested to know sort of your reaction. But I have the sort of following exegesis, if you want, or interpretation of why Bruno says that, namely that, and again, for scholars of Indian philosophy, I'm doing something unpardonable, namely of totalizing traditions, all right, which are vastly different, and sort of putting them in a blanket category of Eastern. But again, just to get some points across with this very, very crude categorization, Eastern non-duality, Bruno points out, is largely experiential, and the sort of unity of consciousness is certainly something that comes out of concrete practices. But of course it is based on philosophical and anthropological understandings. So that, again, to take one from Vedanta, the idea that we humans might see ourselves as waves in the divine ocean. All right, and again, the non-duality is fairly clear when you consider the wave and the ocean. They, of course, are not two, because the ocean has to express itself in the wave, and you cannot separate the wave from the ocean. But nonetheless, one might regard it as distinct, if not separate, because clearly the status of the wave as wave is conceptually distinct from that of the ocean. There's much more in the ocean than just the waves. There are currents below and so on. But nonetheless, it's an appealing, it's one among many pictures of sort of non-duality. But it's not so much the conceptual aspect that is sort of emphasized, though, as I said, that is very much there in the background. It's really the practices that bring about this unitive consciousness, and some of that in Christian, Buddhist, and Christian Hindu dialogue has again been emphasized in the Christian tradition, thanks to Merton and Bruno and many others. But there is an important difference, which I think Bruno is correct to get at, namely the idea that Christianity is in part a historical religion, and the fact is that this gives a certain character to the faith and to the understanding of incarnation, that in addition to the divine being within us, as we heard this morning, there is also the historical fact that when in the sort of linear view of history, when the time is ripe, Jesus appears in world history, and of course in Christian views of history as a form of life, a form of consciousness, the coming of Jesus at a particular time changes history, so that what comes, even in terms of the way the calendar was marked before Christ and post AD, of course things have now changed, but nonetheless, in terms of the difference between Eastern and Western notions of non-duality, the idea is certainly that it's difficult to get the same kind of unitive consciousness when there is an objective fact of history that one is meditating on, as against, if you want, the more mythic consciousness of Indian and Eastern peoples, where the objective facts of history and the transformation of history do not play the same kind of role as they do in broadly Western thinking and Christian thinking. So I suspect that's one among many reasons why Bruno is right in saying that Eastern and Western versions of non-duality will differ and do differ. And the question is, how productive are these differences in terms of the dialogue that one establishes? I mean, clearly there is, if you want, some of the same, but to use the term that Roger and Paul Nitter use in their book, a well-known term in comparative theology, there are sort of functional analogies between Eastern and Western forms of non-duality, because even in Western forms of non-duality, the idea that while Christ acts in history, we Christian disciples are in the world but not of it, and that distinction, that there is still in faith a distance from history and a critique that in the interests of faith we are able to essay on history and on politics, I think is an extremely important point. So the question is how one plays with that idea of being in the world, in history, and yet stepping back in the dynamic of faith to critique history and political life, I think is, if you want, a kind of parallel with the similar forms of non-duality, functionally similar forms of non-duality in the Eastern traditions, where the play of appearances, Maya, are certainly taken very seriously, but the fact that it is a play allows the scope for a kind of critical distance, so that one doesn't sort of get completely immersed in that. So they're not the same, as I said, but there are productive similarities, functional analogies, if you want, between the two. The last point that I want to make, Roger, how am I doing for time?
Well, if you want 10 minutes for questions, you have 15 minutes. 10 minutes for discussion. So finish in 15.
No, I'm going to. Okay, so that means if I finish in 5, we can have 20 minutes of discussion, which is what I want. All right. Okay. All right. Great. Excellent. So the point that I want to end with is something that Chris mentioned in passing in his reflections, and that is that. And I'm sorry, actually, in Bruno's work that it's at least, I mean, certainly in the Future of Wisdom, it's not developed. And that is really his reflection on what today would be called environmental theology, right? I mean, he points towards Teilhard de Chardin and these very broad periodizations, but there is not in the Future of Wisdom a well worked out environmental theology. It's and there is again a tension, if you want, between history and cosmos, which strikes again at the heart of the Christian tradition, given its historical roots, because the historicization, the historical consciousness has, again, to telescope a vast discussion, been largely anthropomorphic and anthropocentric. And philosophically speaking, that anthropocentrism is a large part, together with commercial and technological factors, of the subordination of the earth. And even the metaphors that are used to ameliorate the devastation of the earth, stewardship, care, etc., still place the emphasis largely on humans, all right, so that you still get the hierarchical idea, all right, and of course the classic text here that sort of pointed this out, it was that of Lynn White, The Roots of the Ecological Crisis, written some 50 years ago, an extraordinary article. But to come to its sort of theological roots, there is, for if you want, the scope of Christian theology, how one negotiates the tension between history and cosmos as sort of central categories is certainly, in my mind, not worked out at all in Teilhard de Chardin, and it's sadly sort of lacking in Bruno's work. But if we are going to consider the future of wisdom, this tension is, I think, one that needs to be taken into account. I'm going to use perhaps 5 minutes, even though I said I wouldn't, of an attempt by a theologian to sort of try to work through this tension, and that is that of Panikkar, who has the idea of a cosmotheandric idea, where, again, in brief, the three dynamics of the cosmic, the human, and the divine are brought into interdependence, so that none of them exists as their own, as entities. This is a Buddhist idea of radical relativity, of radical interdependence, so that neither, this is, and of course from Christian theology, a striking sort of proposal, because the divine is seen as non-existent except in relation to the human and the cosmic. And the same goes for the other two dimensions, that the human does not exist as an entity or a force in itself. The human contains the divine and the cosmic, and the same is true of the cosmic. So it's important to recognize the sort of Buddhist character of this, because it's utterly processive. There's no substantial idea here at all. And of course, for Christian theologians to think of the divine, Panikkara's Gifford lectures, which now are published as The Rhythm of Being, when they were given in Edinburgh in 1989, carried the intriguing subtitle of Liberating the Divine from the Burden of Being God. And I think you sort of get the idea that the divine is now being radically reconceptualized, not in theistic terms, but in interdependent, dynamic terms. I never really, I mean, Bruno and I had sort of brief conversations, but I have to confess that I never got a clear answer, and the conversation when I sort of, when we are able to, when we channel, or when I channel him, will certainly, and that works, will certainly be to see what his reaction to one such proposal might be. But it's a sense of how one might think of breaking away from this hierarchical model of the divine human, which, as I say, is a large part of the ecological crisis, when environmental theologians and environmental theology is developed as an organic enterprise. I think it calls for certain fundamental reorientations, of which Panikkara's is one. So I think I'll stop there, and that allows us at least 15 minutes of discussion, right, Roger?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay, good.